Welcome. I'm Carolyn Freund, Dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy, also known as GPS. Welcome to this timely webinar on fixing the climate from San Diego to the world. We have world-renowned faculty at UCSD and at GPS working at the Center of Research and Education on Climate Action. We are interdisciplinary, which is really critical for this topic. At GPS, we have political scientists, economists, scientists, and engineers all working on how to reduce emissions and adjust to climate change. And they also work with the broader UC San Diego community to consider technological innovation, as well as cost efficiency, and then what is actually politically feasible. So we have centers like the Deep Decarbonization Initiative that foster those linkages. And today we have a really great panel, so I'm going to jump right into it. We have Professor Jennifer Burney, who's a professor here at GPS. She's the Marshall Saunders Chancellor's Endowed Chair in Global Climate Policy and Research. And she's going to talk to us about managing the impacts of climate change. We also have Professor George Tynan from engineering. He's also the Associate Dean at the Jacobs School of Engineering and a faculty member in the Center for Energy Research. And we have, of course, Professor David Victor. He's co-director of the Deep Decarbonization Initiative, and he's here at GPS. And he's going to talk to us about his new book, and I have a copy right here, Fixing the Climate. So that'll be great. So why don't we go straight ahead and start with David. And just actually one last thing before we go is this panel really highlights the interdisciplinary nature of our work. We have a scientist, an engineer, and a political scientist all coming together to talk to you. David, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Carolyn. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And thanks to my colleagues and to you for hosting the session today about this new book that Chuck Sable and I have coming out. It just came out from Princeton University Press, coming out in Europe, I think, this week. Some books write themselves quickly. Some books take a while. This one took 8 years. So I'm very happy that the book is out, and it took a long time because we really needed to spend time to figure out how all the ideas fit together. Because on the one hand, we're talking about a familiar topic, albeit a topic that needs to be addressed with interdisciplinary tools for the reasons that Carolyn mentioned. But on the other hand, the argument that we're making is pretty radical. It's in effect an argument about the theory of change and about how are we going to actually fix the climate? How are we going to solve the climate problem? Which ultimately means how are we going to get emissions from the current trajectory where they're rising, 1 or 2% per year, had a big hiccup during the pandemic, but now they have roared back to a situation where they're 80% or more below current levels and declining. And so that's not shallow decarbonization, that's deep decarbonization. How are we going to do deep decarbonization? And that's the theme of the book. It really requires that we rethink the role of policy, the role of firms, the role of government. And that's what we're trying to grapple with. So what I want to do is just take a couple minutes and lay out the kind of macro argument that we make in the book, and then very much look forward to hearing reactions from Jen and from my co-director of the Deep Decarbonization Initiative, George Tynan at the School of Engineering. I think what's really striking about the climate problem, as you look around the world, there's a lot of motivation to do something. Firms are making announcements left, right, and center about net zero targets. Governments are doing something similar. 70 or 80% of the emissions in the world come from jurisdictions that have these kinds of targets. So there's a strong motivation to do something, but frankly, nobody really knows what to do. I think we say that we know what technologies to apply, we know how to do it, but the reality when you look very closely, it's actually uncertainty is pervasive. And the more radical the transformation, and therefore the more important it is for deep decarbonization, the more the uncertainty plays a central role. So the book in the subtitle is actually about uncertainty, and it's about how firms and governments manage these kinds of pervasive uncertainties when there's a strong motivation to act on a problem, but you don't really know what the best strategies are and solutions are and so on. So what we see over and over again in the real world is the same pattern of problem solving in this kind of setting, where there are extremely ambitious goals that are set. Think about the goals today: net zero by 2050, which is the kind of most commonly used goal, and then lots of experimentation. You have some firms and governments that are motivated to go off and try new ideas. They're not sure what works. Quite often they work in teams because it's too risky for an individual firm to, in effect, bet the company. Think about what you need to do in aviation. Stefan Kalbecken and I have a paper out today in Nature about how to make progress on the aviation problem. Making big progress in the aviation problem is going to involve building new kinds of airplanes that might even be bet the company decisions for Airbus or for Boeing. And so the company's not going to do that on its own. It's going to need help working with other like-minded companies, and also help often from government to help manage the risks of these experiments. And then crucially important in all of this is learning very quickly which of these experiments work and which of them don't work. I think there's been too much discussion in the climate world around setting ambitious goals and not enough attention to, do we have the institutions in place to figure out which of these experiments are actually viable, which ideas need to be scaled up, which ideas need to be abandoned, and so on. And so there's an active assessment process, and then adjustment of the goals. Sometimes you make the goals, you ratchet the goals tighter and move faster. Sometimes you loosen them when things turn out to be harder, or you discover dead ends and so on. And so there's this pattern: strong motivation to act, investing in experiments, learning quickly which experiments work and don't work, and then adjusting goals and altering trajectories as a result of that. And what we argue in the book is that that process, which we call experimentalism, that process actually exists all around the world, and we're doing it all the time. We just don't have the right language to talk about it. And some of the biggest success stories around environmental regulation in one form or another are, in effect, success stories where people didn't know what to do in the beginning, and they ran processes like this. That's how California, for example, cleared the air, starting in Los Angeles and other jurisdictions in California. That's how California ended up adopting rules that helped push electric vehicles into service. You had regulators and leading firms setting extremely ambitious goals and then experimenting and adjusting those goals in light of experience. Now, one of the things we do in the book is we begin the book actually with a discussion of the most famous international environmental agreement of all time, the Montreal Protocol on the ozone layer, which, when you look back in history, looks like a case where all we needed to do was get the science right. Gee whiz, we've got a problem with the ozone layer, and then tell firms what to do to go off and control their emissions, and then firms, voila, discovered how to do it. It was cheaper and easier than they originally expected. And so boom, we solved the ozone layer problem. And one of the things we do in the book is we go back and look at the actual history. And what's very, very clear is that early on, actually, nobody knew what the right solutions were. So there's very ambitious goals. And then firms were motivated, in part motivated by concern about loss of reputation. Think about DuPont, for example, which has many analogs today of firms that are worried about, especially electric power companies, worried about destroying their reputations if they're not seen as taking the climate change problem seriously. Growing number of oil and gas companies, even in that domain. And so they went off, and DuPont and others went off and ran a bunch of experiments and searched widely, often with the help of government. Even government, in the case of the United States government, actually had a special alteration in antitrust rules. It made it easier for companies to cooperate, to go off in search of solutions, and then learn quickly which solutions were working, which ones weren't working. And then the rules in the Montreal Protocol actually were adjusted, mostly ratcheted tighter, but sometimes looser, adjusted to address that kind of problem. What Chuck and I argue in the book is that that's how we need to address climate. And I think, if I can just kind of draw two implications of this to close my remarks. One implication is that most of the international diplomacy in this area is overrated. It's not that diplomacy is not important, but it's that experimentation, the incentives to experiment, the ability to learn which experiments work and don't work, that's not going to be done by a global committee organized by the UN operating with consensus rules. It's going to be done in small groups. We used to call them clubs or coalitions of the willing. We used the coalition of the willing term for our second trip to Iraq, so we stopped using that term, not so successful. But that's the idea, is you have small groups of highly motivated firms and governments that are out doing things and learning and testing. And then what that does is it changes facts on the ground. And by changing those facts on the ground, you then also change the politics, because you create firms that have an interest in advancing these kinds of solutions. And so that's how the politics change along with the technology through this experimental process. And so it leads you to downweight diplomacy and upweight first movers coalitions of the willing, and so on, which is in fact exactly what's happening. A lot of that was on display in Glasgow. And the last implication I want to just draw out is this makes you more optimistic about the role of the state. Often we call this industrial policy. I think that term may be getting in the way a little bit here, but the idea that in effect, the government is helping firms change technological facts on the ground, especially where the risks are very high, where new technologies are needed. And then by altering that technological landscape and altering our experiences with deploying these new technologies, you then make it possible to do more and to do it faster. And I think that's the theory of change that is at work here. That's the theory of change that gives you more hope that we're going to address the climate problem, and probably won't stop warming at 2 degrees, but stop it much less than we would have originally thought. And it's a theory that makes you a little more optimistic about the role of government, including in that domain that we used to call industrial policy. And really look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was excellent. And I'm really happy to hear that we may not need as much international diplomacy as we thought, since our international institutions aren't particularly strong right now. So that was really an optimistic message. And I want to push you a bit more on what you mean exactly by industrial policy, because I don't think it's what most economists think about when they use that term. But over to you, George, to discuss industrial decarbonization.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I wanted to pick up on a couple of the themes that David mentioned, and the first of those is the difference between shallow and deep decarbonization. If we talk with the climate scientists, we really see that by roughly mid-century, we have to have squeezed most, if not all, of the net carbon emissions out of our energy system. And given the fact that today, 3/4 to 80% of the energy is actually produced by burning some sort of fossil fuel, that's a tall order. And so that's where we need to go. I think it's always important to keep in mind that partial decarbonization, getting 20, 30, 40% of the emissions out is a good thing, but ultimately that is not enough. We really have to get to zero emissions. And so number one, I just wanted to pick up on that theme. The reason I think that that's noteworthy is it's important to recognize, to David's second point about the value of, I believe he called it experimentation, is, we don't know, at this point in time, we don't know the right mix of technologies and policies that'll get us there. We have some ideas. Obviously, renewably generated electricity is going to be a huge player in that, but there are probably other technologies that are going to have to come into the mix as well. And from our vantage point today, we don't know what that whole mix is going to be. And so it's important to recognize that in addition to deploying cost-effective, carbon-free energy technologies that are in the market now, this is things like solar and wind, but we also need to recognize that there'll be a need for other technologies to complement them as we go forward, and particularly as the market share of those leading renewable technologies grows and it gets progressively harder on the margins to further decrease the carbon emissions, we may need to tap into other technologies that are not at present commercially viable. And so it's important that we have a pipeline of those technologies being prepared and tested out as pre-demonstration pilot plants and demos, and then ultimately they have to win their way in the market. And we need policies that are in place that allows the development and deployment of those emerging technologies as well. And that then just reinforces the importance for experimentation, because we don't know exactly what combination of policies and technologies are going to get us to where we need to go. We need to recognize and value the taking risk and balancing the risk between the public sector, government, and the private sector that ultimately seeks to make a profit from the deployment of new technologies. And so, anyway, I think it's really key to keep in mind the ultimate goal where we have to get, and that we're a long ways from that today. We've made great strides, I would say, in the last decade or so, but we have further to go than we've already come, let's put it that way. And so it's really important to keep in mind that we need to be flexible, we need to be willing to take risk, we need to have partnerships between the public and private for-profit sector, And ultimately, we need to expect that some things will work and some things won't. And when we see technologies that aren't working, don't count that necessarily as a failure of the system, but rather that that's part of the game, and not be dissuaded from the need to keep pursuing the development of other technologies until they either win in the market or are demonstrated not to work. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I look very much forward to the conversation today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Jen, over to you to tell us a bit about the impact and how to adapt to climate change.
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for having me. And let me just begin by saying congratulations to David and Chuck. This book has really changed the way I think. And, you know, as a scholar, that's one of the most wonderful things that can happen. So from a personal place, thank you. Part of what I love about the book is that I think it will help countless readers, specifically of my generation, to make sense of what we feel to be kind of a widely shared global sentiment right now. And that's that most of us are pretty disillusioned with the technocracy in any number of ways, and specifically think of it as having failed on climate. And yet still, we're all sort of feeling in our bones that Paris was or is a big deal. And we can look around and we see examples of things that are working, you know, locally or regionally. So meaningful change is happening, but it seems to be entirely dissociated from the national and international rhetoric. So David, your book, you know, both explains this disconnect and provides the path forward where this is a feature, not a bug. And so it's so validating of this zeitgeist shift, and so constructive in helping all of us think about how we can contribute to an experimentalist approach moving forward. You kept the book focused on the climate arena and mitigation of long-lived greenhouse gases, but since you draw on some related lessons from other areas of environmental policy, and also point towards some broader lessons for, you know, a new globalization paradigm, I thought I'd use my time here to point to a few areas where I see this new governance paradigm as having some success. Then I think we'll get into discussion of some more examples as we go. But the first I'd like to start with is air pollution. You detail some of the Clean Air Act and California Air Resources Board history in the book, but I think we're seeing real traction around the world in using air pollution really as a hook into experimentalist governance that is having really positive spillovers for climate. I think everyone intuitively understands this, but you know, air pollutants are mostly emitted by the same processes that emit climate warming greenhouse gases, so power plants and tailpipes, burning of forests, so on. However, while the greenhouse gases are well mixed and persist in the atmosphere, pollutants stay more local and have more immediate negative impacts on everything from human health and cognition to agricultural productivity. So a decade or so ago, international institutions and national actors, you know, began to highlight the air pollution benefits that would come as a co-benefit of climate change mitigation, and use that rhetoric in an attempt to motivate mitigation itself. But this didn't really have as much impact as I think folks hoped for a variety of reasons, including ones that you detail in the book, right? The fact that traditional rulemaking processes are really inertial, and this impact science was evolving quickly and had some fundamental uncertainty in it. But what did happen is that a lot of jurisdictions realized that they could flip the script. So rather than treating cleaner air as a co-benefit of mitigation, they've instead focused on air pollution itself. And in essence, we've gotten climate mitigation as the co-benefit. And this has been meaningful because, as you detail in the book, right, these sources of air pollution are different in different locations. Airshed dynamics can vary a lot. And so there's both uncertainty and a very obvious need for this process that you get into so richly and that you label contextualization, right? So I'm just thrilled to have this framework because versions of what you've highlighted in the case of California have really happened all over the world, right? We've advanced a ton in the past decade or so in how we think about and address air pollution. And because the sources of greenhouse gases are really the same as the air pollution sources, I think we're going to benefit tremendously from this experimentalist infrastructure when it comes to climate. At the end of the day, we still do have to mitigate those long-lived gases. But I want to point to another place where I think it's very clear that a lot of the ideas that you detail are being internalized. And that's in the Biden executive order on climate. And to me, it's most obvious really in the way that the EO treats environmental justice, right? So when you look at this executive order, it's very clear that environmental justice is a priority for the administration. And there's a general pervasive sort of normative sense of what it means, but there aren't any metrics, right? And no, I and many of us, we've all been indoctrinated in the ways of the technocracy, so this makes us really nervous. But it's true, right? Communities are different. And this issue hits right at the sweet spot of a lot of what you lay out in the book. It's not clear what the right geographic scale or scope is for environmental justice metrics, for example. It's also clear that just like you detail with battery storage, which really provides several services that could be valued very differently by different stakeholders, or just like forests provide a range of ecosystem services, which might be valued very differently by different stakeholders. So too, environmental justice requires this contextualization and this involvement of all the key players in the process, right? And this is a view that's now widely held, right? We now understand that environmental justice is really two-pronged. It's both a question of equitable access to environmental services and procedural justice, right? Or equitable access to the process. And this is just so very much a feature of the success stories that you outline in the book. I give a lot of credit to the environmental justice community for bringing this experimentalist approach, really honed in the domain of pollution and toxic exposures to our national climate policy. And I think we'll be stronger for it. So I just want to say thank you for providing this framework for thinking about a lot of the successes that we've seen recently. And I look forward to more discussion.
Great, thank you so much. And David in his book talks about the local, the national, and the international, and you really brought it, Jen, down to the community level as well. Let me start though with you, George, and ask about where we're making progress. So you focused on really the need to get to zero emissions. And are there industries or technologies or countries that you're particularly hopeful about? Where's progress happening?
I think the thing that strikes me the most is if I compare the situation now in 2022 with, say, 10 to 15 years ago, where essentially there were, except for a few toys on the road, there were no electric vehicles that were commercially available. There were, say 15 years ago, solar power was extraordinarily expensive. Its costs were coming down, but they had a long way to go before they would be cost competitive. I remember in 2009 when Steve Chu became the Secretary of Energy in the Obama administration, and he announced a goal of the Sunshot Initiative, which would bring the costs of solar PV photovoltaic electricity down to $1 a watt. And when I read that as an engineer, I thought, good luck. And yet now it's actually below that. And that's an extraordinary example. And we can get into a discussion of how did that happen and so on. But the fact of the matter is that was a radical change in the cost of a technology that was in the market, but it was just too expensive for widespread deployment. And sort of ditto now for EVs, although they're still quite expensive, but the costs are coming down, principally driven by scale up of manufacturing and cost reductions in battery technologies. So those are two examples of I think the word revolution is not misused in this case. They're truly extraordinary developments in those two particular areas. What we need now is a continued scale up of deployment of those types of technologies, plus similar levels of breakthroughs in many, many others areas, not just of electricity generation, but of say net carbon-free liquid fuels, say for aviation, breakthroughs in industrial processes for manufacturing large-scale quantities of steel, cement, and so forth. So that it's clear that one can point to a number of truly unexpected and very happy developments in the technology front. But the issue is we need many more of those, and we need to deploy what we already have much more broadly than it is today. I'll maybe turn the floor over to David or Jen for further discussion.
Maybe David, if you could just add to that, or Jen, how important was policy in that, in those technologies happening? Did it happen just because they were expanding and the market would have made it happen? Did policy speed it up so it happened 5 years earlier, or was it critical, and which policies?
Yes, I mean, it's a big question, and I think the areas where I'm actually most hopeful, I'm going to answer this in a process way, which is we see more and more places around the world that are doing what Jen described, which is they're trying to figure out what they value, how you do this in the real world, either how you push the technological frontier or how you learn how to use new technologies in context, what we call contextualization in the book. And that's what ultimately changes the facts on the ground. You know, sometimes policy doesn't play a role at all. It just is manna from heaven of new innovations. And I think one of the things that's interesting in the energy business is the role of outside exogenous innovation has gone way up, partly because of digitalization. So much is changing in the energy space right now, because at least the frontier of technological possibilities has been shifted by innovation and IT and so on. It's kind of washed into the energy space. But the energy fundamentally is, and the industrial system fundamentally is capital intensive. You know, already these are capital intensive systems. Almost all the studies suggest that a clean economy is going to be even more capital intensive. And if we can amortize that capital efficiently, then actually costs could be lower, but it's going to put a really big premium on the efficient allocation of capital. And I think that's everywhere we turn, we see a big role for policy. And so let me just take up one of the examples, George's example of solar. Solar is cheap. This is a lovely book by Greg Nemeth called How Solar Got Cheap. It's a website too, look at the information there. And solar is cheap in part because of technological innovation, and in part because we had open global markets where innovations that started here and in Japan, then moved to the global market, then they were improved in Germany through the Energiewende, moved through the global market, then they moved through the manufacturing revolution, really driven by China, and now spreading more widely. And solar is cheap everywhere because of that. And so I think we often focus on policy that provides direct support for technology, and certainly that's a big factor, but also the policies that enable a much wider scope for improving technology. You know, I dare say, call it globalization. I'm a globalist at heart. That's actually been a very, very important part of the energy revolution, and some of this onshoring stuff people are talking about could actually make that harmful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And solar could even be cheaper if we didn't have tariffs on it. But I think the point of innovation and then scaling where it can be scaled is so important. So I'm very worried about deglobalization and reshoring for the potential to produce all these new renewables and energy saving products. Jen, what is your view on the policies that seem to be working well? And also, how do we know they're working well? What do you do to be able to tell that they're actually working and that it was driven by policy?
Yeah, so 2 questions. I'll try to take them in reverse order first. You know, how do we know things are working, and how, really more broadly, how are we learning, right? So things might not be working, but we want to course correct quickly. I think that's a huge takeaway from David's book, right? Is that the sort of information and data revolution, whether it's from satellites or information that you can get through you know, surveys or cell phones, has really been integral in understanding, you know, the complicated and multidimensional decisions that everyone involved in these problems is making. So, right, a case study in the book is really how batteries are being used, right? And people have very different preferences for how they would utilize storage, and now I have my app on my phone and I can decide if my battery in my house is going to back up my refrigerator or is going to be allowed to charge my car, or is going to be allowed to feed back to the grid, right? All of that allows me to optimize my own system, but it also provides a tremendous amount of information for those trying to actually make the grid stay functional. And ultimately, that's something that we all share and value. So this kind of rapid learning environment has really rested a lot on new technology. And so I think, new methods of learning are being developed almost in real time. And that's, for a geek like me, that's one of the most exciting pieces of this. David and I look forward to many more hours of conversation long beyond this about that, because it is really, really exciting, and thinking about how to fold that in even more rapidly and to learn better and faster is really exciting. Where are we doing well? So we've talked about decarbonization, really focused kind of on energy, transportation, George, and a little bit of industry. I'll take us to another extreme and talk a little bit about agriculture and land use. This is tricky, and it really sits kind of at the other end from capital intensive infrastructure, and really is, right, this is one of the world's largest, most complex system, 600 million farmers, all of us are consumers, tens of millions of intermediaries, right? How do we think about decarbonizing the world food economy, right? At the end of the day, we kind of know what some of the technologies look like in other sectors. And when we look at agriculture, we still have something right now like a ton or two of carbon dioxide per person per year for food, and it's not clear how low we can push that. So I would say there's a real technological frontier here, but we also have seen a lot of progress, right? So our agricultural emissions kind of come from two bins. One is really deforestation and land use change. We've learned a ton about what works. And when we talk about data revolution and real-time monitoring, satellites have been indispensable to the progress that we've made on this front. But in addition, there are emissions from agricultural practice itself, just emission from soils, emissions from residue, manure management, agricultural burning. And these are, again, thinking about really localized, hyper-localized domains that really need this contextualization that David's book talks about. This is it. And yet we've got some really great success stories, right? So the US has incredibly high rates, for example, of no-till agriculture. We have become incredibly emissions efficient in the way that we produce food through extension, technology, and the ability to really do hyper local agricultural management. And this is in part through this co-production of knowledge, right? Firms and farmers and policymakers and regulators are all kind of working together to understand what the frontier is, and then adjusting our policy incentives and mechanisms to go along with that. And then we ratchet when we can, and we adjust on the go. So this is a really great example of what the book details. In part, it's I'm not sure how many people realize that this conservation policy, this key piece of really U.S. climate policy, is part of our omnibus farm bill, right? But this is also an institutional design that is really very much in the spirit of this experimentalist ethos that David laid out, right? It ties a lot of policy together: agricultural production, our social safety net around food, conservation policy, et cetera. And that really brings people together who need to be thinking about these issues together. We've got a great, funded research apparatus around this. And this has a built-in cycle of renegotiation and discussion every 5 years. Every 5 years, both sides in the US threaten to blow it apart. Hopefully that doesn't happen, because it's really been successful in creating the kind of innovation that's ultimately been so good for climate.
Excellent, thank you. And thanks for highlighting the importance of monitoring and measuring, because if we can't monitor or measure it, we can't really control it. So I think that's really important. There's a couple questions in the chat, and do feel free to post questions there. I'm going to build off of one, which is the first one that came in, around how do we balance existing investment in existing technologies with all this risk and experimentation around new technologies. And I guess what I would build on that is the role for the market and for government policies, which gets us to the second question, where ethanol was such a good example of good intentions going awry. And so how do we think about this? It's complex. And I think your book starts to get to policies that can work, which aren't exactly industrial policies, but maybe David, you could start, and then George, if you want to come in, or Jen.
Sure, thank you very much. And I think the point that you're making, to kind of summarize Jen's comments, Carolyn, about monitoring and measurement is really crucial. And that's one of the things we do very well at GPS, is we have a whole program using the latest techniques around program design and evaluation. I think one of the reasons that Chuck and I wrote this book is that it's also crucially important to have a good theory. And if you have we're offering a theory along with some applications and kind of a way of rethinking history through the lens of this theory. We have a theory that explains why we observe success and failure in the world, then we have a better shot at going off and measuring accurately and testing and so on. So the question from Matthias Einberger, a graduate of our program, in the chat about limited resources, I think we are overweighting the familiar right now. And we're doing that in part because there are good political reasons for it. When you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA that just passed, $369 billion for clean energy, the vast majority of it is spending to get firms to do things we already know how to do. Actually, we're probably going to pay a lot of firms to do things they would have done anyway. And some of the money could go into experimentation and innovation. I'm concerned, Chuck and I have an op-ed coming out next week, I think, in Yale E360 on this subject. I'm concerned that the mechanisms that are being used to implement this are most of the tax credits, for example, flow through the IRS. So the IRS is not an industrial policy organization. The IRS is an accounting organization, and that's great. But we're not going to really be testing a diverse array of different technologies and learning quickly what works and doesn't work through that kind of mechanism. We're going to need to do something else. And there are some pieces in place that could make that possible. John Podesta's just taken over an office created inside the White House to oversee implementation of this, and hopefully that'll involve a lot of attention to investing in new technologies. But when you come back to Matthias's question, we're massively overweighting the familiar and underweighting the experimentation. And part of it is that when you experiment with new ideas and new institutions and new technologies, is you're doing things that support interest groups that don't exist. Because if you had already experimented and been successful, the interest groups would be there, the Teslas would be there. And so the politics really overweights you in the direction of the familiar. And so I think that's going to be crucially important. And this relates, I think, also to the question that David Edick put in about ethanol. I'll set aside the question of whether it's good intentioned. Certainly ethanol votes, especially in Iowa. I think it's a reminder that one needs to have mechanisms to really evaluate whether policies are having the kinds of intended effects, and being able to sunset those policies if they don't actually work. One of the great ironies of the ethanol business is it could well be that the ethanol's biggest impact on the climate is not going to come from the conventional ethanol industry, but it's going to come from the fact that you've got all these companies, ADM and others, that have these big ethanol refineries that are making ethanol to meet the way the current fuel blending rules are written in the United States. But an ethanol refinery also has a very concentrated stream of carbon dioxide that comes off it. And so it's pretty easy to capture that. And one of the earliest applications of the new tax credits for carbon capture and storage will actually be on ethanol plants. I just spoke a couple weeks ago with a colleague who's running part of the business at ADM. And so we're going to actually be seeing early deployment of carbon capture and storage technology is very important on ethanol facilities. So that may eventually be one of the areas and ways that ethanol helps do more than get people reelected through the Iowa caucuses. But I think the larger point, Carolyn, is exactly right. Is we have to keep evaluating policies against the goals and do it in a pretty rigorous way.
And Carolyn, I would just add to David's comments that when we use the word experimentation, it's important to recognize that the experimentation needs to be not just among trying out in the market sort of nascent technologies that have been are trying to be demonstrated. Let's put it that way. But there's a rich spectrum of innovation and experimentation, all the way from fundamental laboratory research. I'm thinking, for example, we need many people talking about green hydrogen as an energy carrier that could have some very attractive applications that are difficult to switch to electrification. And yet, if you look at what's holding the widespread adoption of green hydrogen, it's the cost of electrolyzers, the devices that convert electricity and water into free hydrogen. And in order to get those costs down, one has to have more effective cathode and anode materials. These are the parts of the device that produce the hydrogen. They have to have longer lifetimes, be more efficient, and so on. And fundamentally, at the end of the day, that comes down to discoveries in material science, in electrochemistry. And then once you have an idea in a laboratory, how do you then translate it, scale it up to industrial scale, pilot scale, and then ultimately, if it's demonstrated, have its day in the market to see if it can displace other technologies. And so it's important in thinking about Matthias's question about balancing the resources among near-term existing technologies versus developing longer-term new technologies into the marketplace. It's important to recognize the need to have the investments all the way from the fundamental research all the way to demonstration and then ultimately deployment. I would also point out that the relative cost, the amount of capital investment that may be needed, can be quite, orders of magnitude different when you're talking about fundamental research versus applied research versus pilot plant demonstration, and then incentives for deployment into the market. And so I guess I would argue is that there's no need to think that this has to be an either or question. It's really one of balance. And I think when one looks at the relative scale of that whole pipeline of innovation, that frankly, we can afford to do it if it's a priority.
So one of the participants wants you to bet the house, but I think what you're saying is it's a question of balance. And actually the whole point of this is you need to be experimenting everywhere.
Exactly.
If you had a house to bet, is that how you would do it? You would distribute it around, let all the flowers bloom? Or is there one particular technology you're gonna put the house main bet on?
Well, I'm an applied physicist and engineer, so I love basic research. But it would be more the 1,000 flowers bloom. I'm absolutely convinced there's not one or two or even a handful of technological solutions. There has to be, maybe the metaphor is you need a whole series of instruments playing together towards the same end, off the same sheet of music, if you will, trying to get towards a solution. I'm very skeptical of claims that there's just going to be a few solutions, renewables or the nuclear crowd or whatever. None of those by themselves will get us to where we have to go. It will be a joint effort with many, many technologies and policies.
So I want to shift to institutions for a minute and first go to Jen about in California and how you can design your institutions so they learn and adapt with what we need. And also to David and George on the upcoming meeting in Egypt. And one thing that came to me on that is maybe we should be more concerned about cooperation on trade to help us with climate than cooperation on climate itself. But Jen, over to you. And if you want to feed into the previous conversation, go ahead as well.
Sure, thanks. Yeah. So David and Chuck do a great job in the book of talking about the characteristics of institutions that learn and thinking about this question of portfolio allocation that just got raised, right? One of the a little bit more implicit takeaways from the book is that it's really important to have institutions decoupled from political cycles that are focused a little bit more on the long term, or can be focused on learning rapidly, but with a long time horizon. So one of the examples is the ARPA-E program in the book, which is, is a crown jewel of bipartisan respect and support and pride, in the United States, because it's like, when you're listening about ARPA-E projects, you feel like you're living in the future and people are excited about it, right? And this is, of course, funded on budget cycles, but it's really meant to be a research entity that lives a little bit outside of the political maelstrom, and that's important. We've seen similar importance with, for example, the CGIAR, the International Agricultural Research Institutes, right, who have sort of maintained long-run threads of research for sort of crop resilience, and then interact with national and local institutions to do that contextualization. But the sort of core research activities exist a little bit outside of the fray. And I think that's one way that we can all be thinking about balancing that near-term versus long-term portfolio, and sort of the need for both. We need to spend government money locally on things that we think are going to work in the short term, and we also need to be investing in these longer run experimentalist visions. Bringing it to California, California has been a sort of leader in this. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't understate the fact that California swings its economic power around pretty mightily. Not everyone can set standards, but California is a big enough economy that when we decide to push the frontier, we can pull others along with us. And there's a couple of nice examples of that in the book. One version that's happening right now actually is around groundwater in California. We have in the last drought, passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, mm-hmm. which takes a very California approach, right? Similar to the Air Resources Board. It says, let's put relevant experts kind of at the sort of review head of this, and we're going to bring people together. Groundwater users are going to self-organize the way we had people organized into air sheds. They're sort of organizing into groundwater sheds, and they're going to, come up with plans to manage their resource according to some big ambitious targets. And then, it's the job of the state to set that big ambitious target, and the job of, this sort of oversight agency with the relevant skills involved to help these agencies review their plans, to call them out when they're not working or when they're, not ambitious enough, and to really make sure the whole thing holds together. So, we're in the midst of a very California experiment in another domain right now, but that has been a formula that has worked, and we've seen, other, provincial level or state level governments from other countries really come and try to learn from the California case. I'll pass it to David.
Thanks so much. I just want to, I'm really pleased to have you mention the SIGIAR institutions, because they're a great example. This was originally started by some private foundations in the World Bank. Great examples of contextualization of new technologies. You've got a set of ideas about new crops, but they only work if farmers know how to use them. And so what the SIGIR does, like agricultural extension traditionally in the United States and other places, is works with farmers at the frontier so that you've got both the technological innovations and all the other practices. And that's a good example of the kinds of things that are needed. That's actually how the Montreal Protocol became global, is that basically funds were supplied directly to the developing countries to help them build up local offices, which will relate to what I want to say about what's happening in Egypt, what we should expect to happen in Egypt. You asked, though, Carolyn, about the California institutions. There's an interesting kind of tale of two experiences that we tee up in the book, and it's the California Air Resources Board. California Air Resources Board has been highly, highly effective when it operates in the traditional regulatory model, where it sets ambitious goals, for example, in the automobile sector, and then it's frankly splits the industry. It identifies parts of the industry. You see this right now with GM and Ford coming along on electric vehicles, but not all the others, at least not as quickly. It splits the industry so that it has some industrial partners that can help the regulator understand what the technological frontier is, and then it's adjusting the rules to reflect what that knowledge is. That's been highly effective in how California cleared up the air. That's been highly effective in a lot of other programs going on in California, including energy efficiency programs and so on. CARB also runs a market of the cap and trade program in California, and it's a disaster. I mean, it's a fake market. It looks like they're trading the right, the emission credits, and it looks like the market's doing all this work, and it's completely nonsense. And it's because the market doesn't apply any of those principles. The market operates on the assumption that everybody knows what technologies to choose and how the market's functioning, and that you know how to identify good quality credits and bad quality credits, even though none of those assumptions are true. And then you have this fake market going on. And so it's very interesting to watch California, because California overall has been this huge leader. But some of the institutions work well, and some of the institutions don't work well. And I think it's a reminder to us in California that the whole game on climate is not just to be a leader. The game on climate is actually to get followers, like to look in the rear vision mirror and see other people following us, because we're less than 1% of global emissions, and our emissions are shrinking because we're doing all this stuff to control our emissions. And so, frankly, leadership's irrelevant without followership. And I think we've been underemphasizing the followership side of things, and overemphasizing, how, in almost a smug way, how great it is to be a leader. Briefly on Egypt.
But that brings us exactly, sorry to interrupt, but that brings us exactly to why this is a global issue, because no country can deal with this alone. So you need international cooperation. But Jen made this point that institutions that are subject to political winds are pretty dangerous when it comes to this. And certainly the international institutions, as we saw during the Trump administration and US pullout and so forth, and lack of progress in climate in general from the international institutions has been problematic. So what can we do? You're at least optimistic we don't need them that much.
Yeah, and I think it's partly because of the theory of change here. It's a global problem, but one theory of change is it's a global collective action problem. So you need to put at the margin incentives so that there's no free riders. Yeah. That's a hard problem to solve. It's essentially an impossible problem to solve, and it leads you to very pessimistic conclusions. If you think the problem is actually a global learning problem, where the pioneers are going off doing things, changing facts on the ground, lowering the cost of new technologies, then what was a hard problem to solve, a global collective action problem, becomes not trivial, but easier to solve, because it's about collective learning and keeping markets open and things like that. And that's my concern about Egypt, is that one of the really important things that diplomacy does is it gives legitimacy to this whole process. And the big threat to legitimacy right now is that the developing countries in particular feel that they've gotten screwed, I think is a technical term for it, feel that they were promised a bunch of money and other resources. They didn't get it in Glasgow. They kind of got a deal to work harder, and they're not going to get it. If anything, the situation's gotten worse thanks to the invasion of Ukraine and all these other things that have been very distracting. And so I'm very concerned that the diplomatic politics going into Egypt are not auspicious. And you could actually see a replay of, for example, the Copenhagen conference in 2009, where actually there was no formal agreement in the end, and folks just left without being able to agree. And there, we got to be super sensitive about holding together the positive things that are happening and showing here's what's really happening on climate, and not letting the whole thing blow up because of the diplomatic troubles.
Speaking of the diplomatic troubles, I think there are lessons that can be learned from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Europe being so dependent on Russian energy. What do they tell us that might be useful for energy transition and climate change? And I'll turn to George.
the thing that first comes to my mind is this illustrates the time scale that strategic decisions on energy technology deployment, because as David said earlier, it's typically a very capital intensive business. The timescales involved are much longer than what we're used to typically dealing with. So, in Europe, decisions were taken many, many years ago to engage with Russia as a major supplier of natural gas. No one ever dreaming that we would be in the situation that we are in today, and yet the knock-on effects of those decisions in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent economic sanctions placed on Russia it shows that the decadal or even longer than decade timescale for decisions on energy and how they can affect economies. And so I think this just reinforces the fact that this is a very large scale system it's a very difficult ship to change its direction once decisions have been made and capital investments have been put in place. And the other, I think, lesson that comes to my mind is it just reinforces the importance of having stable, adequate energy supplies in whatever form they are, how absolutely critically important that is to the functioning of a modern economy. We're seeing discussions now of shutting down major industrial fabrication facilities in Europe and the United States because of this. Things like aluminum smelters and steel plants that take weeks or even months to restart once they've been shut down. So those are the two most striking lessons that come to my mind. David, I don't know or Jen, if you have further thoughts.
Let me just say very briefly, the loss of plausibly the most valuable energy source for the modern Western European economy, which is gas, principally from Russia, and so much of German industry, think of the frontier steel operations, glass, all kinds of other industrial operations that have high heat needs that you can't meet with electricity or can't meet at reasonable costs. And you can meet some of them with some other industrial processes. Can't switch that overnight. One of the big impacts of this is it's been existential for these industries. And it's very interesting to watch how a firm responds to incentive structure that's existential as opposed to a compliance problem. So many of our normal kind of, you internalize the externality, you figure out the optimal tax, and the firm says, okay, I got to comply with the new tax. And so they readjust their production methods using known technologies and they comply and they optimize. That's when markets work really well. When the markets don't work as well, market solutions or strategies don't work as well, when the firm faces an existential threat, like a massive loss of reputation, or in this case, going out of business because you don't have gas. And so then you've got to search more widely for solutions, take bigger risks. And it's not just a matter of internalizing externalities. There's a concept in contract law called the penalty default. And Chuck and I talk a lot about it in the book, because it's those extreme incentives that are actually what's motivating a lot of firms today, whether it's German firms concerned about the loss of gas supply, or it's European oil and gas companies concerned that they're going to not be able to be in business if they don't take climate change seriously, or American utilities, same kinds of incentives. And that's motivated the search for new alternatives and greater experimentation. And it's a really interesting shift in our normal thinking about the role of incentives.
Yeah, absolutely. Jen, there's also some questions that are coming in about developing countries and how they're being affected and all this. And a debate that we often had when I was working at the World Bank was, and that we'd hear from developing countries themselves, was they didn't contribute to the problem, and yet they're now asking to do everything they can to pay higher prices for energy or renewables. How should we be thinking about prioritization? How should we be thinking about developing countries? How can we get that money to them that really they are owed because they weren't contributors to this problem?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it gets at the heart of whether or not this next COP will be a success, because this is the fundamental question of climate justice, right? Which is that those who did not create the problem at present are getting hurt most by it in the immediate term, and are in some, feeling like they're being held to task unfairly. The Montreal Protocol, as David and Chuck outlined in the book, provides a good roadmap for this, which is to allow, non-big emitters to not be beholden to this sort of international regime. It's a little bit different because we're sort of talking about an ambitious decarbonization vision that's actually globally shared, right? These countries share this vision, and so they do want to contribute, but the claim is correct that what's really needed is financial assistance to be able to play their role. I think at the beginning, and maybe I'll send this back to David, the vision was, okay, here's going to be some $100 billion pot of money, and it's going to get sprinkled around. And in reality, that's not how things happen. And COP, the Paris Agreement and the infrastructure around it is not well suited to playing that role. What's really well suited is investments in things like the CGIAR to work with national agricultural services and direct bilateral or multilateral or regional club investments in national and regional sectoral services that can best take advantage of and understand and contextualize the appropriate portfolio of technologies for their own region. And that's really where the looming hole is, I think, right now in the global climate infrastructure, if we want to call it that, right, is the sort of bilateral and multilateral set of agreements and investments that would facilitate that. It's not going to be a giant pot that gets sprinkled.
Yeah, in trade, we call that special and differential treatment. I don't know if the same term is used in climate. And did you have anything to add on that, David?
Well, I think this goes to the heart of the diplomatic problem, because the lesson we've learned from the SIGIAR institutions, the lesson we learned from Montreal, is that if you use these funds and you use them to build capacity, and also including the capacity to understand which experiments are working and not, then you in effect change the political interests on the ground inside the country, and it's very beneficial use of these funds. But that's not the way most of the developing countries are thinking about the climate funds. So there is a special dedicated fund called the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, and it's a horrifically managed institution that does almost nothing useful. Because we're on the record, but I can say that. And it's not designed to be experimental at all. And now that's a small fraction of the money. And the rest of the money, in principle, if it flows, is going to flow through some bilateral institutions, other things. And some of it might be spent well, some of it might not be spent well. But there's no mechanism in place to figure out whether it's being spent well or not spent well. And so it's like the whole diplomatic community that's working on climate, with very few exceptions, has been sleepwalking for the last 30 years, thinking that what they were doing was replicating the Montreal Protocol and not paying attention actually to what really made Montreal work. And that's part of the reason why we wrote the book. And I think, frankly, I won't call them villains, but some of the actors that are causing the biggest trouble right now around climate are folks who have a theory of change that's not connected to reality. And that's going to be on display in Egypt.
There was also a question in the chat about philanthropy. And it made me think also, you can think of really big government interventions such as Warp Speed, which put so much money into vaccine development, and they actually came out of a new technology that hadn't really been used before, the mRNA. So when you think about philanthropy, something like Warp Speed, or using taxes, which we should do a heck of a lot more of, carbon taxes, to get prices right. How do you, and I'd really like all three of you to chime in on this, how do you kind of rank these policies, or is there a way you would, and what would you recommend? So I'll start with you, George.
I can't speak too much about policy since I'm an engineer physicist, but I would just, coming back to your analogy with the COVID vaccines development and deployment in the Warp Speed efforts in the previous administration and the Biden administration, that was built on many previous years of development of just mRNA vaccine technology independent of COVID before COVID burst on the scene. And then because we had the capability and the fundamental understanding about fundamental biological science, we were in a position to rapidly develop and deploy those vaccines, fortunately. So the scale up depends and assumes the existence of a public good, the fundamental knowledge, in that case, the understanding of fundamental biology and how to manipulate RNA at the molecular level to do what we want it to do. And so I would just argue that that analogy has to carry forward into the deployment and development of carbon-free technologies as well. So
the research is there in the background.
Yes, because if it's not, then you don't have the foundation to build upon when you do need it. So,
Jen?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think this really points to this this need to keep basic research and really, applied research going, across sectors. But when we're thinking about the climate problem, we don't know what's going to work for, the deepest part of deep decarbonization in a lot of ways yet. And we need to be, investing in that learning apparatus so that the suite of choices that are there and that different actors can use will be ready when the time, when the time comes. I agree with George entirely on that.
And David, what are your thoughts?
So I want to come back to the philanthropy point in particular. I think philanthropy is very interesting because it's now become highly material, partly because of persistent underspending by the federal government, notably also some states. Most states don't do anything in this domain on fundamental research. And so philanthropy has grown and it's occupying some of this role. I would add to philanthropy hobbies. I think there's a lot of money being spent on energy and climate right now by very rich billionaires, mostly middle-aged white guys, doing fun stuff, things that they think is fun, and some of it's helpful, some of it's not helpful, and so on. I guess I would say to philanthropists, you really need to do a careful evaluation of what you think is going to happen in the world without your money, and then make sure your money is being spent and you're evaluating constantly, including as a group, what's working. And the philanthropic world does that periodically, but the evaluations never really seem to have much impact, as far as I can tell, having been involved with some of them, on how the money actually gets spent and whether the money is really helping solve these problems. I'll say one last thing about this, which is some people are critical of experimentalism because it seems like it's a slow process. But I think it's an unavoidable process. If you pretend to know things you don't know, then you end up spending a ton of money on things that are not the right choices. You overweight some solutions and not others. And so they really have no alternative. But the logical extension of that is we're in for a lot of climate change. Even if we get serious about the problem, as we are, I think, not enough, but starting, we're in for a lot of climate change. And so I think the whole philanthropic world, among other things, is underweighting innovation and experience with regard to managing the impacts of climate change, and overweighting the kind of cool stuff like advanced power generation technologies that can lower emissions, not because the cool stuff isn't fun and interesting, but because the overall social portfolio of effort needs to take more seriously the idea that we're going to have to grapple with a lot of physical impacts.
Yeah, and I just want to say one more thing to the philanthropists, which is, as you can see, at UC San Diego, we have great innovation happening in our engineering department and elsewhere, great measurement happening here in GPS and policy design. So this is one place where I think the returns are really quite high. Sorry, I had to put in the commercial there. Yeah, we're now back from the commercial break. We don't have that much longer, so I'd like to give each of you a chance to talk about anything I haven't or that hasn't come up in the questions that you'd like to. And maybe in particular, George, we haven't talked that much about other technologies and specifically nuclear and what you think of those. And then for David and Jen, more along the policy front, we also haven't talked much about taxes and the use of taxes to shift incentives, if you want to add anything, or of course, anything that I've just completely overlooked. So actually, why don't we go in reverse order from the presentation? So start with Jen.
Thanks for the first bite at the apple. I guess I would say, first of all, I think, David, the book is hopeful. So I appreciate that, because I think it really does provide a view in which it's not a top-down policymaker or some ground-up political organizer that's going to like somehow stumble on the panacea and make the change that needs to happen, but really it's a vast, vast web, and we can all see a role for ourselves in a regime that's sort of an experimentalist learning climate apparatus. And so I really appreciate that for highlighting the role that so many different types of people with all sorts of different expertise and experiences can play. Where I do think we have a bit of a hole, and where we need to figure out how to learn more is really in the fact that a lot of the innovation that needs to happen doesn't fit neatly within most regulatory impact assessment frameworks, right? So whether it's cost benefit analysis, or maybe you've got some multi-attribute decision set up, a lot of the innovation we know needs to happen is going to be costly up front, and it's going to have hard to enumerate and hard to value benefits that will spill out across different sectors and over different time horizons. One concept that came up in David's book was about grid reliability. It's incredibly valuable to both individuals and grid operators, and it's almost impossible to put a number on it. Sure, you could put like the value of services lost if you don't have reliability, but how do you actually positively value reliability in a decision framework, right? So there's a lot of concepts like that that we know are going to propagate, and our policy frameworks and our regulatory frameworks are not well equipped to deal with that. And that's where I think we really could use more direct investment in learning as co-managers of this climate situation.
Thank you. George.
You had asked me, Caroline, sort of about the role and the status of other technology, carbon-free energy technologies. I'll just comment briefly. I think there's certainly a pretty clear recognition that renewables, and particularly wind and solar generated electricity, are probably going to grow very markedly in their market penetration over the coming decade or so. But I think there's also a growing realization that as we approach 100% decarbonized electricity, the marginal cost of additional carbon-free power from those sources becomes more expensive, in part because of the need to maintain reliability. And so there's an increased focus on how do we address that issue with either storage technologies, and there's a whole debate about which, is it batteries, is it pumped hydro, is it flow batteries, is it power to gas, and so on. There's a contingent arguing for the need for advanced nuclear technologies that are more economically competitive and have better public acceptance. And for me, I take that as progress, that there's a growing recognition that we're going to need to deploy a suite of carbon-free generation technologies. And there's a growing sense within the research community of the importance and the need for breakthroughs that, particularly in the engineering and the materials that go into some of these technologies, to make them competitive. So from that, I think that's progress from where we were 10 or 15 years ago. And we'll have to see whether the non-renewable technologies find their place in the market or not I think in the coming decade or so.
Yeah, and I guess just to offer my comments, I agree with what Jen and George have said. Let me say three things very quickly. First, I really appreciated Jen's comments that this is a hopeful book. There are too many gloom and doom books about climate. I think it's hopeful and realistic because it's saying, here's a theory of change. Here's actually how we use it all the time. We just don't have the words for it or have not had the words for it. And here's what that means from the case of addressing the climate problem in a realistic timetable and so on. And it's a theory of change where technology is central, but it's not a technocracy. It's not the technocrats telling everybody what to do and so on. It's actually building and sustaining political interest to make this happen. Second comment is I think we have to be very careful about the institutions getting in the way, because especially in regulatory systems, there's a real risk of excessive stovepiping, especially in the case of the United States, where we've got all this political gridlock. It's very hard to actually have statutory reform, and so you're stuck with old laws that, the Clean Air Act hasn't been revised since 1990. So you got old laws doing new tricks, and that's very hard for regulatory agencies. And then on top of all that, you've got the notice and comment process, which often looks on the surface like experimentalism, but often can be very sclerotic in its way. And the last is about taxes and incentives. I really appreciate that comment because, in a world, you see this in the United States, in a world where you can't get enough political support for anything, you end up doing too many things with carrots and not enough with sticks. And we need to create some incentive about the real cost of carbon. We should not expect, however, that the tax levels are going to reflect the real externality. Danny Cullenward and I had a book we published a couple of years ago that looks at the real record with cap and trade and tax-based systems. And you just almost nowhere in the world do you see the prices allowed to really, do you see these mechanisms allowed to work the way they should work in theory, because the politics of that are really hard. And so we should recognize that maybe the biggest value of taxes, of these penalties, is to send a signal about what we need to try and reduce, to raise funds, to be able to purpose, and according to normal standards of good public finance, to be able to apply to the purpose of helping to fund some of these experiments and learn from that.
Thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. I want to remind everybody that we were focused around David Victor's book, Fixing the Climate, which really has an optimistic message. And as David said, it's great to have that, especially in this period when the world is a little bit dysfunctional. So I hope you're able to get it. And the other point that I take from the discussion, especially the part from about technology, is that it's lumpy. So progress happens suddenly. So we need to experiment, because that's how we're going to find these sudden, large, important jumps. Jen reminded us of the importance of measurement. If we can't measure it, we can't improve it. Something here we focus on a lot at GPS. And going back to the experimentalism, it also helps to protect us from lock-in, which is so dangerous that we end up with the wrong technology or missing a potentially fruitful one because we put all our eggs in that one basket. And then finally, I think the most optimistic and really, really refreshing message that I took as someone who focuses a lot on international trade and international institutions is that in this particular case, they may not be quite as necessary as we would have thought. We still want them to work, so don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we don't need them, but a lot can be done even when they're not functioning at the level that we would have liked. So thank you very much. We'll have more webinars and in-person events here at GPS, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.